When Sarah Orne Jewett was born in South Berwick, Maine in 1849, the town and region she would memorialize in her fiction were already changing rapidly. Her father had been a sea captain, ship owner, and a merchant, and as a child she was exposed to the bustle of this small inland port. By the end of the Civil War, however, textile mills and cannery had largely replaced the agricultural shipbuilding and logging as the economic base of the community, and the arrival of the French Canadian and Irish immigrants brought greater ethnic diversity to the area. The stable, secure, and remote town Jewett knew and loved as a child was experiencing the economic, technological, and demographic pressures that transformed much of America in her lifetime. Think of this as the rapid change that we see in America today. The rapid change from largely manufacturing economies to a digital and data economy, or agricultural economies in straight skipping the manufacturing into the data and information economies. Jewett and her two sisters led happy and generally carefree childhoods. Their father was a kindly, hard-working obstetrician who encouraged Jewett's reading. As a small child, she accompanied him on his horse and buggy rounds, meeting the rural people who would later populate her fiction. Jewett loved her father deeply, and some of her strong feelings for him are invested in A Country Doctor, written in 1884, a novel that also celebrates the independence of its female protagonist. Jewett's relationship with her mother was less intense. It was not until her mother became an invalid in the 1880s that her mother and daughter became close. As Jewett confessed in a letter to the editor friend Thomas Bailey Aldrich, "I never felt so near to my mother as I have since she died." In part inspired by Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel The Maine Seacoast Life, The Pearl of Orr's Island, written in 1862, Jewett began to write and publish verse and stories in her teens. One of her first efforts was accepted for publication in 1869 by William Dean Howells, then assistant editor for the prestigious Atlantic Monthly. In her early 20s, encouraged by Howells, she wrote a group of stories and sketches about a fictional coastal town in Maine to which she gave the name Deep Haven. She published her first collection of short pieces in 1877 under that title. With the publication of this book, she entered the company of many post-Civil War regionalist writers who were depicting the topographies, people, speech patterns, and modes of life in the nation's distinctive regions as they came under pressure from the modernizing forces. From the late 1870s on, Jewett was part of a circle of prominent writers, artists, and editors who lived in or near Boston. The relationship between Jewett and Annie Adams Fields, the wife of the highly influential editor and publisher James T. Fields, was the most important of her many friendships with men and women. Though they had known each other since the late 1870s, it was not until Annie Fields' husband died in 1881 they established a bond that was to sustain both women until Jewett's death in 1909. During the winter months, Jewett lived in Fields' house in Boston, and in the spring and summer was often to be found at Fields' oceanside home a few miles north of Boston and Manchester by the Sea. Jewett maintained her residence in South Berwick, and she and Fields would spend time together there as well. Their relationship, common at the turn of the century among single women who lived and traveled together, was often called a Boston marriage. Scholars interested in the 19th century history of same-sex desire have frequently turned both to Jewett's biography and to her fiction, where deep, emotionally complicated attachments between women figures is featured predominantly. Jewett reached artistic maturity with the publication of A White Heron and Other Stories in 1886. Later collections of sketches and stories, including The King of Folly Island in 1888, and Native Winby in 1893, and Life of Nancy in 1895. In these works of the local landscape, people, and dialect are recorded with the understanding that sympathy. In A White Heron, reprinted here, A young girl's conflicted loyalties to her conception of herself and nature and to the world of men she will soon encounter are memorably and sensitively drawn. Longtime residents of these small Maine communities make up the bulk of Jewett's fiction, including her most endearing work, The Country of Pointed Firs, written in 1896. This book is comprised of a series of linked sketches filtered through the consciousness of a summer visitor, much like the person Jewett had become. In this work, bits and pieces of the lives of small groups of men and women are quilted into the unified impression of life in a once prosperous shipping village. The strong older women who survive in the region form a female community that, for many critics, is a hallmark of New England regionalism. The chapters of the book reproduced here and introduced in The Summer Visitor and the community of Dunnet Landing, as well as a history of maritime activity through the figure of Captain Littlepage. The book was well received, and Jewett would go on to publish 4 additional stories about Dunnet Landing. Before her death in 1909, Jewett met the Admiral Willa Cather, who would celebrate and edit Jewett's work in the decades to come. For Cather, The Country of Pointed Firs ranked with The Scarlet Letter and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn as a landmark of American literature. As you can see, Sarah Orne Jewett is going to be a largely influential figure in the development of American literature and how America and American life is portrayed over time. It is my challenge to you this week as we read A White Heron by Sarah Orne Jewett, that you challenge your ideas and beliefs of how your community is perceived by other worlds and by other people, because we all live in our own independent and individualized worlds. How would you write about your community today? These are major questions that I want us to continue to work with as we read this story. Remember the 3 keystones of American regionalism, and I'll see you all very soon.